August 1945. Across 3 continents, from the airfields of England to the islands of the Pacific, thousands of North American P-51 Mustangs sit in gleaming rows under summer skies. Their silver fuselages catch the light, bubble canopies glinting, Packard Merlin engines still warm from recent missions. These are not the battered relics of a defeated enemy. These are the victors, the aircraft that swept the Luftwaffe from the skies over Berlin, that escorted B-29s to Japan, that helped bring the war to its end. Yet within weeks, a question emerges that no one had properly considered. What precisely does one do with more than 5,000 of the finest piston-engined fighters ever built when the war they were designed to fight has suddenly ended? The numbers confronting American planners proved staggering. North American aviation had produced 15,586 P-51 Mustangs during the war, making it one of the most manufactured fighters in history. By the time Japan surrendered, approximately 5,500 remained on hand with the Army Air Forces. They were scattered across more than 40 airfields throughout the Pacific and continental United States, from Iwo Jima to England, from the Philippines to bases across California and Texas. Each aircraft represented an investment of roughly $51,000, the equivalent of nearly $600,000 today. The fleet's total value ran into the hundreds of millions. The challenge facing commanders was both practical and political. Maintaining thousands of high-performance fighters required substantial resources, trained mechanics, spare parts, hangars, and constant attention. The Packard-built Merlin engines, while legendary for their power and reliability, demanded regular maintenance. Each engine contained hundreds of precision components, and the liquid cooling system required constant monitoring. Fuel costs alone represented a significant burden, with each aircraft burning approximately 60 gallons per hour at cruise settings. Yet the Mustang possessed capabilities no other American fighter could match. Its extraordinary range, over 1,600 miles with drop tanks, the very characteristic that had allowed it to escort bombers deep into Germany and back, made it uniquely valuable in an era when the Soviet Union was emerging as a potential adversary. Strategic planners understood that any future conflict might require long-distance strikes, and the Mustang remained the premier long-range single-engine fighter in the Air Force inventory, its efficiency and range unmatched by any comparable type. The Army Air Forces made a critical decision in the months following victory. Unlike the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning, which were rapidly phased out of frontline service, the P-51 Mustang would become America's standard piston-engined fighter. The Thunderbolt and Lightning continued in diminished roles with the Air National Guard and foreign operators for several years, but neither enjoyed the institutional priority afforded to the Mustang. This single decision shaped the aircraft's remarkable post-war journey. While other wartime types faded into secondary roles or disappeared into scrapyards, the Mustang survived, adapted, and continued to serve. Demobilization proceeded rapidly through late 1945 and into 1946. Thousands of Mustangs were declared surplus, their fates determined by condition and location. Aircraft deemed uneconomical to return to the United States were scrapped overseas. At bases in England, mechanics stripped valuable components before the airframes were cut apart. In the Pacific, some aircraft were simply pushed into the sea or burned, the cost of shipping them home exceeding their residual value. Those that made the journey back arrived at storage facilities across the American Southwest, where the dry desert air promised to preserve them for future use. Davis-Monthan Field in Arizona became a primary destination. Row upon row of silver Mustangs accumulated there, engines pickled against corrosion, cockpits sealed against dust. At Walnut Ridge in Arkansas and other facilities, similar scenes unfolded. The reserve fleet theoretically remained available for rapid reactivation should international circumstances demand. Yet, the advent of jet propulsion had already begun rendering propeller-driven fighters obsolescent. The question became not whether the Mustang would be replaced, but how long it might remain useful. In September 1947, the United States Air Force was established as an independent service, separating from the Army for the first time. The new service inherited the Mustang fleet. Then, in June 1948, a new designation system took effect across the Air Force. The P-51 became the F-51, the old pursuit designation giving way to the more straightforward fighter classification. Strategic Air Command initially employed Mustangs alongside the F-82 twin Mustang, valuing their range for potential long-distance operations. But jet fighters were clearly the future, and active-duty Mustang squadrons steadily converted to newer types. The Air National Guard became the Mustang's primary home through the late 1940s. State-based Guard units across the country received F-51s as frontline squadrons transitioned to jets. From Vermont to Tennessee, from West Virginia to California, Air National Guard pilots flew Mustangs on training missions and air defense exercises. The aircraft proved ideal for this role, reliable enough for weekend warriors yet capable enough to maintain combat readiness. By 1950, however, only 99 Mustangs remained in active Air Force service. The type seemed destined for a quiet retirement. Then came Korea. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded the South. The invasion caught American forces unprepared, their combat power depleted by post-war demobilization. The only American aircraft in the region were F-80 Shooting Stars and F-82 twin Mustangs operating from Japan. While these jets performed admirably, they faced critical limitations. The F-80's high fuel consumption meant brief loiter times over the battlefield. Its early versions lacked adequate hardpoints for ground attack ordnance. Perhaps most critically, the primitive airfields in Korea could not support jet operations. The Mustang's moment had returned. Within weeks of the invasion, the Air Force began pulling F-51s from storage at Davis-Monthan and returning them to operational status. The aircraft's long range proved invaluable, allowing missions from Japanese bases that jets could not sustain. Its rugged construction tolerated the rough, improvised airstrips of wartime Korea. Armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns, rockets, napalm, and bombs, the Mustang became a devastatingly effective fighter bomber. By August 1950, 145 Mustangs had been rushed to the theater. They equipped units including the 18th Fighter Bomber Wing and flew thousands of close air support and interdiction missions against North Korean forces. The aircraft that had once dueled with Messerschmitts over Berlin now strafed supply convoys along Korean roads, blasted bridges spanning icy rivers, and provided desperate cover for retreating infantry. The Mustang's liquid-cooled Merlin engine proved both blessing and curse in Korea. While reliable and powerful, delivering nearly 1,500 horsepower, the cooling system's vulnerability to ground fire meant that a single bullet through a coolant line could bring down the aircraft. Unlike air-cooled radial engines that could absorb significant damage and keep running, the Merlin would overheat and seize within minutes of losing coolant. Losses mounted steadily, with ground fire claiming Mustang after Mustang as pilots pressed their attacks against heavily defended targets. Pilots learned to make their strafing runs fast and shallow, minimizing exposure to the deadly curtain of small arms fire that rose from every North Korean position. Yet the alternatives were limited. and the Mustang continued flying combat missions until jet fighter bombers finally replaced it in 1953. Australian pilots of No. 77 Squadron flew F-51s for 9 months before transitioning to Gloucester Meteor jets, losing 10 pilots killed in action and 4 more to accidents. South African pilots of No. 2 Squadron flew the type until 1952 and 53, when F-86 Sabres finally arrived. South Korean aviators, some of whom had flown for the Imperial Japanese forces during the previous war, operated Mustangs throughout the conflict. The Korean War represented the Mustang's final American combat deployment. By the time the armistice was signed in July 1953, the type had proven itself in an entirely new war, a quarter-century removed from its original design. Surviving aircraft returned to Air National Guard service or were transferred to Allied nations. The last American military Mustang, an F-51D assigned to the West Virginia Air National Guard, was finally retired in January 1957. But the Mustang's military story was far from over. In the years following World War II, the P-51 had been sold or given to more than 25 nations around the world. Many of these aircraft served for decades in foreign air forces, their careers extending far beyond anything their designers had imagined. Sweden became one of the largest overseas operators, purchasing 161 Mustangs designated J-26 between 1945 and 1948. Swedish pilots used them for interception duties and, remarkably, for secret reconnaissance missions over Soviet Baltic installations, intentionally violating Soviet airspace while photographing new military facilities. The Mustang could outdive any Soviet fighter of that era, so no Swedish aircraft were lost in these audacious operations. Switzerland acquired 100 Mustangs in 1948, operating them until 1956. Italy received over 170 examples through military aid programs, flying them into the early 1950s. Canada operated the type with reserve air defense units, while Australia built 200 under license through Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. New Zealand assembled 30 Mustangs from packing crates in 1950, assigning them to territorial defense squadrons. Perhaps no country's Mustang service proved more colorful than Israel's. A handful of aircraft were smuggled into the newly declared state in 1948, crated and labeled as agricultural equipment. These fighters joined the desperate defense against Arab armies and quickly established themselves as the best aircraft in the fledgling Israeli Air Force. More arrived from Sweden in the early 1950s, and Israeli Mustangs saw combat in the 1956 Suez Crisis. In one remarkable operation, 4 P-51s were detailed to cut Egyptian telephone and telegraph wires to disrupt communications. The aircraft were originally fitted with trailing cables and hooks designed to snag and sever the lines. When these improvised systems failed during the mission, the pilots famously resorted to using their propellers and wings themselves, diving to extreme low altitude and physically slicing through the wires in passes that required extraordinary precision and nerve. Latin America became a final stronghold. The Dominican Republic acquired 44 Mustangs in 1948 and, astonishingly, operated them until 1984. The last military Mustangs anywhere in the world. Guatemala, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Cuba, Haiti, Uruguay, and El Salvador all flew the type through the 1950s, 60s, and even 70s. The most extraordinary chapter came in July 1969, during the brief conflict between El Salvador and Honduras that became known as the Football War. Following riots at World Cup qualifying matches, the two Central American nations went to war for 100 hours. Both sides deployed World War II-era aircraft. Corsairs, Mustangs, and even converted transport planes serving as improvised bombers. On July 17th, Honduran Corsair pilot Captain Fernando Soto engaged Salvadoran aircraft in combat. In a series of dogfights that afternoon, Soto shot down a Cavalier Mustang and two Corsairs, becoming the last pilot in history to achieve air-to-air victories in piston-engined combat. The football war marked the final time Mustangs and Corsairs would fight, a curious coda to the careers of aircraft designed 25 years earlier. The Mustang's transition to civilian life had begun almost immediately after the war. Surplus aircraft flooded onto the market at bargain prices, some selling for as little as $3,500. Private pilots, racing enthusiasts, and Hollywood studios snapped them up. The combination of speed, range, and availability made the Mustang irresistible. Air racing had been a fixture of American aviation since the 1920s, and the Mustang proved ideally suited to the sport. Film stunt pilot Paul Mantz purchased a P-51C and modified it with sealed wing tanks, eliminating the need for drag-inducing drop tanks. Named Blaze of Noon, the aircraft won the Bendix Trophy race in 1946 and 1947. Charles Blair later flew the same aircraft, renamed Excalibur III, to set a New York to London record in 1951, completing the crossing in 7 hours and 48 minutes. The Cleveland air races featured Mustangs prominently until a tragic 1949 crash led to restrictions on military surplus aircraft in competition. Air racing effectively ceased for over a decade. Then, in 1964, the National Championship air races began at Reno, Nevada, reviving the sport in the high desert. The Mustang dominated Reno's unlimited class from the beginning. Racers modified their aircraft extensively, clipping wings to reduce drag, adding more powerful engines, streamlining every possible surface. Some replaced the Packard Merlin with the larger Rolls-Royce Griffon, requiring entirely new engine mounts and propeller systems. Cooling systems were redesigned, canopies were lowered and faired, and every unnecessary pound was stripped away. Speeds climbed steadily. Stock Mustangs had cruised at around 350 miles per hour. Racing Mustangs began approaching 500. Aircraft named Dago Red, Strega, and Voodoo became legends of the racing circuit, their purple and orange paint schemes instantly recognizable to fans who gathered in the Nevada desert each September. The sport was not without tragedy. In September 2011, a modified Mustang named the Galloping Ghost crashed near the grandstands at Reno, killing the pilot and 9 spectators on the ground, a stark reminder of the risks inherent in pushing 70-year-old airframes to their absolute limits. In September 2017, a heavily modified Mustang named Voodoo achieved a remarkable feat, averaging 531 miles per hour over a measured course in Idaho. This represented the fastest speed ever recorded by a Mustang. However, the run sparked debate among aviation purists. The previous record holder, a modified Grumman Bearcat named Rare Bear, had set its mark decades earlier, and international rules require a new record to exceed the previous one by at least 1% to be officially recognized. Voodoo's speed fell just short of that margin. Still, whether technically official or not, the achievement demonstrated that 80 years after the prototype first flew, the Mustang remained capable of extraordinary performance. What remains of the mighty Mustang fleet today represents the smallest fraction of what once existed. Of the 15,586 built, approximately 311 complete airframes survive. Of these, around 160 are airworthy, perhaps 66 sit in museums as static displays, and the remainder are in storage or undergoing restoration. The survivors are scattered across the globe, Museums in the United States, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, and a dozen other countries display Mustangs to visitors each year. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum preserves several examples. The National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson maintains aircraft in combat-era markings. Private collections and organizations like the Commemorative Air Force operate flying examples at air shows and commemorative events. A flying Mustang today commands prices between $2 and $5 million, reflecting both scarcity and the passionate demand among collectors. Operating costs prove substantial as well. With the Packard Merlin burning roughly 60 gallons of aviation fuel per hour. Maintaining airworthiness requires specialized knowledge that grows rarer with each passing year. The pool of mechanics who understand these aircraft shrinks steadily, yet the Mustang endures. Some of today's survivors served in multiple air forces across decades, their logbooks recording service with the USAAF, then Sweden, then Latin American nations, before finally entering private hands. A handful have the distinction of having served 4 different countries over careers spanning more than 30 years. The story that began in August 1945 with thousands of silver fighters scattered across the globe concluded with systematic disappearance driven by obsolescence, economics, and the relentless march of aviation technology. Within a decade of the war's end, the vast majority had been scrapped, sold overseas, or reduced to components. Within 2 decades, the type had largely vanished from military service. Within 4 decades, only a handful of foreign operators remained. What survives today represents less than 2% of the original production. These precious fragments, maintained by passionate enthusiasts and institutions, serve as tangible reminders of an aircraft that changed the course of aerial warfare. The Mustang that swept the Luftwaffe from the skies, that escorted bombers to Berlin and Tokyo, that found new life over Korea and Central America, that still races across the Nevada desert at speeds approaching the sound barrier, remains one of aviation's most enduring legends. The few dozen Mustangs displayed in museums and the 100-odd still capable of flight tell a story larger than any single aircraft. They speak to the scale of American industrial production, to the rapid obsolescence of military technology, to the dedication of those who preserve history. They remind us how thoroughly even the most celebrated machines can vanish when their moment passes. Above all, they demonstrate that the Mustang was never merely a weapon of war. It was an engineering achievement, a pilot's dream, a racing champion, and now a treasured artifact. 80 years after the last factory examples rolled off the production line, the Mustang lives on, silver against blue sky, the distinctive sound of its Merlin engine a call across the decades to an era when propellers ruled the air. If you found this video insightful, make sure to drop a like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more history inside. Thanks for watching.